This video is brought to you by Brilliant. With November fast approaching, most pundits and analysts have their attention squarely focused on the swing states that look set to decide the upcoming election. These states are polled consistently, to the extent that you probably know ahead of time which way it's going to fall. However, there is one state that's nearly impossible to poll thoroughly, where no one really knows exactly what's going to happen, and that's Alaska. Despite long being considered a Republican stronghold, their margins of victory have been narrowing ever since really the turn of the millennium. In 2000, Bush won the last frontier by over 30 points, but in 2012, Romney won by just 14 points, and in 2020, Trump by only about 10. Polling in Alaska is nearly impossible because of its disparate geography, but the most recent poll there actually had Harris breathing down Trump's neck, just 5 points behind him among likely voters, and only 4 amongst so-called supervoters, i.e. voters that friends and family rely on when asking how they should cast their vote. So, in this video, we're going to take a look at the political history of Alaska, why it's shifting purple, and if it could actually turn blue. Before we start, if you haven't already, please consider subscribing and ringing the bell to stay in the loop and be notified when we release new videos. First, a quick political history. As you may or may not know, the US actually purchased Alaska from the Russian Empire in 1867 for $7.2 million, equivalent to $129 million today. The Russian Empire had just suffered a catastrophic defeat in the Crimean War, and in dire need of cash and realizing that the territory would be nearly impossible to defend in a future war, Alexander II decided to sell it. At the time, the land was essentially empty, save for a few seal fisheries, and it stayed that way for the next 30 years or so. Then, in the late 1800s, a few thousand people moved there as part of the Alaskan gold rush, and developed a domestic fishing and logging industry. By the early 1910s, Alaska had a population of about 50,000 people, but it wasn't actually a state, rather it was technically a territory, as defined under the Second Organic Act of 1912. Alaska's strategic importance became more apparent in the Second World War, especially after Japanese forces invaded and occupied a handful of islands on the outer stretches of the Aleutian chain. And then in the Cold War, when Alaska's close proximity to the Soviet Union encouraged the federal government to build a series of large airfields on the territory, as well as the Alaskan Highway linking Dawson Creek with Fairbanks. This new military presence was great for Alaska's economy, and its population tripled between 1945 and 1970, with more than half of the population in its remote communities working for the military. Anchorage became a hub for trade and transportation between Europe and Asia, and the military's experience and infrastructure allowed private companies to prospect for Alaskan oil, which was discovered just off the Alaskan shore in Swanson River in 1957. Washington soon decided that Alaska was large and populous enough to be a state, and on January 3, 1959, President Eisenhower officially made it America's 49th state. When it entered the Union, the state was staunchly Democratic. Its governor, state legislature, US House representative, and its 2 US senators were all Democrats, and while it narrowly voted for Republican Richard Nixon in 1960, Democrat Lyndon Johnson won a landslide in the state in 1964. However, as the Republicans became the party of rural conservatives, the state went comfortably Republican, voting for Reagan in 1984 by over 35 points, and for George W. Bush by a similar margin in 2004. However, as we mentioned in the intro, Republicans' advantage at presidential elections has waned over the past few cycles, and Trump won by just 10 points in 2020. So, what has caused this gradual but consistent shift to the Democrats over the past 20 years? Well, census data suggests it's been driven by 2 things: a leftward drift in Alaska's most rural areas amongst Alaskan natives, and a leftward drift in Anchorage, Alaska's most populous city, which tracks a wider trend of Democrats doing better and better in America's urban areas. We can see this if we look at the results of boroughs and census areas. For context, Alaska has 19 organised boroughs, which are sort of the Alaskan equivalent of counties. But these don't cover the entire territory, and the remaining unorganised borough is split into 11 census areas, which each roughly corresponds to electoral districts. This means that, de facto, Alaska has a total of 30 electoral districts. Anyway, in 2004, almost all of them went for Bush, but Obama flipped 5 of them in 2008, and then flipped another 7 in 2012 while holding down the other 5. Obama made his biggest gains in the rural parts of the unorganized borough, but also ate into Republicans' vote share in some of the cities. Clinton won the same number of districts as Obama in 2016, albeit by lesser margins, and then in 2020 when Trump flipped one back and won the state by 10 points. Anchorage, by far and away the most populous borough, went Democrat for the first time since 1964. Then, in 2022, Alaska elected its first statewide Democratic congressperson in 50 years, when Mary Peltola won in a special election, following the death of longtime Congressman Don Young. Many Democrats see Peltola as a rising star and expect her to have a bright future in Alaskan politics. So, given this trend, could Alaska go blue in 2024? Well, the answer is probably not. Even if he's down a bit, Trump is still very much the favourite. The Economist's election model, for instance, gives him a 94% chance of winning, while Nate Silver gives him a 77% chance. In 2020, Alaska also adopted a new ranked choice voting system, which allows voters to rank their preference candidates, so if their first choice is eliminated, their votes go to the second favourite. This was partly how Peltola won her seat in 2022, but this time Trump might get a boost from RFK Jr. voters, who would otherwise be wasting their votes, but who could instead see them transferred over to Trump. It's also worth saying that, even if Alaska did go blue, because it only has 3 electoral college votes, it would be unlikely to actually make a difference to the result. There's maybe a scenario where Trump wins Pennsylvania, but not Michigan and Wisconsin, where Alaska could be decisive, but it's unlikely. Nonetheless, one of the things that makes Alaska so interesting is the high degree of uncertainty. The population is small, it's nearly impossible to poll, and the margins have been narrowing for a while now. And even if Trump wins, it's worth paying attention to his margin of victory. If it's smaller than in 2020, Alaska could well be in play in 2028 or 2032. What do the world's best politicians have in common? They're willing to learn something new every day. And if you think that sounds too hard or too time-consuming or just too overwhelming for you to do, then you haven't tried Brilliant.org. Brilliant is where you learn by doing, with thousands of interactive lessons in maths, data analysis, programming, and AI. Like I said though, the real value here is that you can do this easily every day, truly committing to lifelong learning. Slowly, over time, you'll not only pick up new skills or get better at maths, but you'll also feel the satisfaction that comes with bettering yourself and staying ahead. For instance, if like many world leaders, you want to get better at handling finances, you might want to check out the ton of new data science content Brilliant has just released, all of which uses real-world data to train you to see trends and make better informed decisions. They're perfect for learners of any level to start or continue learning data analysis, with a full suite of new content covering data visualizations, algorithms, regression models, and more. Plus, you can gain additional insight by working with real datasets from sources like Airbnb, Spotify, Starbucks, and more. To try everything Brilliant has to offer free for a full 30 days, click on the link in the description.